Papillon. The indomitable will of man towards freedom.
Opening. Have you ever imagined how desperately a person can long for freedom? It's not just the vague desire of wanting to be free. It is the kind of desperation that would make someone risk their life 9 times and throw themselves into a sea teeming with sharks, relying on just a coconut sack. The story I will introduce today is about one person's determination toward freedom. Today's video will focus on Henri Charrière's autobiographical novel, Papillon, exploring the intense imagery left by the 1973 film, as well as the actual historical controversies surrounding it. Henri Charrière, nicknamed Papillon. He is the man who is called that because of the butterfly tattoo engraved on his chest. In the story, he is sentenced to life in forced labor for a murder he insists he did not commit, and is sent to the notorious penal colony in French Guiana. It was known as a hellish place, from which no one could escape alive once they entered. But Papillon did not give up. For 13 years, he survives with only one thought: escape and freedom. This work, Papillon, caused a tremendous stir as soon as it was published in France in 1969. An autobiographical novel that Henri Charrière claims to have written based on his own experiences. It sold 1.5 million copies in France alone in its first year and became a bestseller, with tens of millions sold worldwide. In 1973, it was also adapted into a film starring McQueen and Dustin Hoffman, which became very popular. In today's video, we will take a deep look at Papillon's harrowing 13-year escape and the greatness of the human spirit contained within it. If you stay with us until the end, you will never take the word freedom lightly again. Then let's get started. Part 1. The false accusation and the journey to hell begins in Paris. France in 1931. The protagonist, Henri Charrière, was a young man of 25 at the time. Living in the back alleys of Paris, he was not a model citizen with a respectable job. With a butterfly tattoo on his chest, people called him Papillon. It means butterfly in French. One day, something shocking happens to him. A case of a brothel owner being murdered occurs, and Papillon is identified as the culprit. Papillon cried out that he was innocent. However, in front of the corrupt prosecution and the perjured witness, his cries had no power. The trial was formal. The prosecutor portrayed him as a dangerous individual who must be permanently removed from society, and ultimately, the court sentenced him to life in forced labor. A verdict was handed down to the 25-year-old young man to spend the rest of his life in prison. Papillon makes a vow in his heart towards those who wronged him in the courtroom. I will survive and take revenge for this injustice. This desire for revenge, along with his conviction of innocence, becomes the driving force that helps him endure the 13 years of hell he will face. He is being loaded onto a ship heading to French Guiana with other prisoners. This French colony, located in the northeastern part of South America, had a notorious penal colony. This place, called Bagne, was where France sent criminals, deemed the most dangerous to be subjected to forced labor until they essentially died. The conditions inside the ship were miserable. Hundreds of prisoners were trapped like animals in the cargo hold as they crossed the Atlantic. The heat, the stench, the diseases, and the violence among the prisoners. Papillon witnessed for the first time how cruel humans can be, and at the same time, how resilient they can become. On this ship, Papillon meets the individuals who will become his lifelong companions. Among them, the most important figure is Degas. Degas is a forgery expert who was being sent to a penal colony for embezzling a large sum of money. He had a lot of money, but he was weak and terrible at fighting. On the other hand, Papillon had nothing, but he possessed a strong body and an indomitable will. The two formed an alliance to protect each other. Here, we learn about a unique way of survival in the penal colony world. The prisoners hid money in a metal cylinder called flang inside their bodies, specifically in their intestines. It may sound horrific, but this money was the only means of survival and escape in the penal colony. Whether bribing the guard or saving the ship, everything required money. The reality of the second type of prison and the dream of the first escape. Finally, the ship arrives in Guyana. The reality of the penal colony that Papillon faced surpassed imagination. The system here was cunning and cruel. The French government operated not just by imprisoning the prisoners, but by slowly killing them. They made them work in the malaria-infested jungle, gave them nutritionally poor food, and imposed harsh punishments for even minor violations. Statistically, a significant number of prisoners sent here have died within a few years. Escape was considered nearly impossible. What was particularly frightening was the solitary confinement, trapped in a narrow room where no light enters, completely isolated and unable to speak to anyone. This mental torture drove many prisoners insane. However, from the very first day he arrived, Papillon thought of only one thing: escape. He had no intention of accepting this place as his grave. He constantly observed his surroundings, studied escape routes, and looked for companions to escape with. What did freedom mean to Papillon? It was more than just getting out of prison. It was about proving his innocence, reclaiming his dignity as a human being, and resisting the absurd system that put him here. Papillon seizes the opportunity to be hospitalized. The hospital was relatively poorly guarded, making it the best place to attempt an escape. He makes his first escape plan with his companions Degas and Clouchot. This first escape well demonstrates Papillon's boldness and meticulousness. He overpowers the hospital guards and successfully boards a pre-prepared boat to head out to sea. Finally, he takes his first step towards freedom. Part 3. The sea, jungle, and the paradise of the indigenous village. Relying on a small boat, Papillon and his companions set out into the vast ocean, battling rough waves as they sail for several days. For them, lacking sailing experience, the sea was another prison and a test. During this journey, Papillon receives help from remarkable individuals. One of them was the people living on the island where patients with Hansen's disease gathered. The patients with Hansen's disease, abandoned by society, extend a warm helping hand to the fugitive Papillon. They provide Papillon and his companions with a sturdier boat and food. The humanity shown by the people at the very bottom of society. This scene is one of the most moving parts of the entire work. Papillon arrives at the Colombian coast after many twists and turns, but is rearrested and imprisoned again. But he escapes again. This time, he flees into the jungle and reaches a village of indigenous Indian tribes living in the northern Guajira Peninsula of Colombia. Life in this Indian village was the most peaceful and happy time in Papillon's life. In this place, far removed from civilization, the natives welcomed him warmly. They had no money, no laws, and no prisons. Only a pure life in harmony with nature existed. Papillon lives here as a diver harvesting pearls. He forms a family with 2 young indigenous women and even has children. Here, he experiences true peace and love for the first time. Here, we pose an important question. Papillon has already gained his freedom. He was able to live peacefully with his loved ones, without any interference from others. Then, why did he leave this paradise? This is the essence of the character known as Papillon. What he desired was not simply a comfortable life. He wanted to prove his innocence to those who framed him, and completely regain his lost identity and dignity. Life in the Indian village was peaceful, but it was the life of a fugitive. It was not the life of someone who had won their freedom. In the end, Papillon heads back to the civilized world, leaving behind the people he loves. Part 4. Captured again, and having left the solitary paradise, Saint-Joseph, Papillon begins a perilous journey once more. However, fate betrays him once again. He seeks help at a convent, but is rearrested due to the report of the abbess, who deems him untrustworthy. The scene where he is betrayed by the religious figure he believed would help him leaves a deep psychological scar on Papillon. Upon being sent back to the penal colony in French Guiana, Papillon is met with harsh punishment for his escape. He was sentenced to 2 years of solitary confinement on St. Joseph Island. This solitary life is the most desperate part of the work. Papillon is trapped in a narrow solitary cell that barely lets in any light. He could not talk to anyone, and the guards regularly patrolled to monitor whether the prisoners were going insane. The food was terrible, and exercise was limited. How did Papillon maintain his sanity in such extreme isolation? He developed his own mental training methods. Every day, he embarked on a journey of imagination by walking in his solitary cell at a set time. He reflected on past memories in his mind, devised escape plans for the future, and conducted a mock trial with those who sent him here. In his mind, he repeatedly imagined bringing the prosecutor and the perjured witnesses to the stand, questioning them about their crimes. The body was imprisoned, but no one could confine his mind. This part showcases a magnificent scene that demonstrates the greatness of the human spirit. It shows that no matter how harsh the environment, it cannot completely crush a person's will for freedom. Another impressive aspect shown by Papillon in solitary confinement was loyalty. He never reveals the name of the colleague who secretly brought him food. Although the guards tried to persuade him that revealing the source of the food would reduce his sentence, Papillon chose to endure greater suffering rather than betray his comrade. As a result, his food intake decreased even more, and he reached the brink of death from malnutrition. But he ultimately did not betray his comrades. After 2 years of solitary confinement, Papillon emerged with a broken body, but his mind had become even stronger. Part 5. The endless escape attempts continued, and even after coming out of the solitary confinement in the mental hospital, Papillon's will to escape was unbroken. He keeps devising new escape plans. During this time, Papillon also attempts very clever strategies. It was exactly pretending to be insane. The mental hospital in the area had relatively lax security, making it easier to escape from there. Papillon successfully gets admitted to the mental hospital by pretending to be crazy. However, this operation was very dangerous. Living among real patients with severe mental illness poses a risk of losing one's own sanity. In fact, the descriptions of this mental hospital are very chilling. Uncontrolled violence, unsanitary conditions, and people who have lost their humanity. Papillon attempts to escape from here with a companion, but tragically loses that companion in the process. Here we can see that Papillon's escape was by no means a romantic adventure. Every moment was close to death, and many companions lost their lives during the escape process. Papillon himself faced the brink of death several times. Nevertheless, he did not stop, because his desire for freedom was greater than his fear of death. Papillon says this in the work. The moment you lose your will for freedom, that is the true death. For him, giving up on escape and conforming to the penal colony was no different from being alive yet dead. In the final stage of Chapter 6, after numerous escape attempts, Papillon is finally sent to the most notorious place. It is none other than Devil's Island, Île du Diable.
Devil's Island is a small rocky island off the coast of French Guiana, used to isolate the most dangerous prisoners with the highest likelihood of escape. The reason this island was considered impossible to escape was solely because of the sea surrounding it. The fierce waves, sharp rocks, and above all, the sea teeming with sharks made this natural prison stronger than any man-made barrier. In fact, this island didn't even require a separate high wall or strict security. The sea itself was a perfect prison. Most prisoners lost all hope when they came here. They simply waited to die quietly on the island. However, Papillon was different.
He observed the sea every day to find a possibility of escape, even from this inescapable island.
And finally, he makes a discovery that no one had thought of. After observing the waves crashing against the cliff for several days,
he discovers that massive waves come in at regular intervals and then pull back strongly into the sea.
by utilizing the force at the moment the seventh wave, this large wave recedes, he calculates that an object dropped from the cliff can be pushed far out to sea from the island. To verify this hypothesis, Papillon repeatedly conducts experiments by throwing bags filled with coconuts off the cliff. And finally, he becomes convinced. Loading myself onto a makeshift raft made by tying 2 coconut sacks together, I believed that if I threw myself from the cliff into the sea, in time with the 7th big wave, I could survive. This was truly a gamble for my life. If even the slightest calculation was off, he was destined to either crash into the rocks and die instantly, become shark bait, or drift aimlessly in the vast ocean until death. However, for Papillon, a life without freedom was meaningless. On this Devil's Island, Papillon meets a companion named Dustin. Papillon suggests that he join him in his escape plan. However, the cautious Dreyfus hesitated on his first attempt and nearly lost his life by crashing into the cliff. Papillon did not abandon his confidence in his plan, even at the risk of his companion's death. Finally, in part 7, the day of freedom and destiny has arrived. Papillon stood on the cliff of Devil's Island, holding a buoy made of a bag filled with coconuts.
In front of him was the endless sea, and beyond that, freedom awaited.
He counts the waves. 1, 2, 3.
And finally, at the moment when the enormous 7th wave crashed against the cliff and receded,
Papillon threw himself into the sea without hesitation.
the power of the gigantic wave was exactly as he had calculated.
The waves forcefully pushed him away from the island, into the middle of the sea.
It was the result of 13 years of patience, observation, and indomitable will.
Now he begins to drift across the vast ocean. The blazing sun, thirst, hunger, and the threat of sharks. But he hangs onto the coconut sack and endures until the end. After drifting for several days, Papillon finally reaches the coast of Venezuela. Thus, after 13 years since his first arrest, Henri Charrière finally obtains true freedom. He is accepted as a free man in Venezuela and begins a new life. Later, he obtains Venezuelan citizenship and settles down, living the ordinary and free life he has longed for. At the end of the work, the emotion when Papillon set foot on the land of freedom is beyond words. His one shout, "I did it! I am free." All the pain and endurance of 13 years were for this one moment. The meaning and message of the work. Now let's think together about the message this great story conveys to us. First, Papillon is a story about the greatness of the human will towards freedom. Papillon shows to the extreme how far a human can go for freedom. Over a long period of 13 years, despite countless failures, being captured, tortured, and facing death, he never once gave up on his dream of freedom. We often get easily discouraged by small difficulties in our daily lives. The story of Papillon reminds us of how strong the human will can be. Secondly, this work is about human dignity. The penal colony system tried to strip prisoners of their humanity. They treated them like beasts, called them by numbers, and trampled on their hopes. But Papillon maintained his dignity until the very end. He did not betray his colleagues, did not succumb to injustice, and treated himself as a human being. His escape was not just a simple flight, but a rebellion of dignity against a system that treated him as less than human. Thirdly, this work is also a story about humanity and solidarity. Papillon was never alone. The forger Louis Degas, the patients with Hansen's disease who helped them, the Indians, who shared love, and the countless companions who dreamed of escaping together, all showed humanity to one another despite being abandoned by society and at the very bottom. We often associate humanity with social status or moral reputation. But this work shows that true humanity can bloom even in the most miserable places. Fourth, it is a critique of the absurd system and judicial justice. Papillon lost his life for a crime he did not commit. The work exposes how a corrupt judicial system and inhumane punishment can destroy a person's life. In fact, since the publication of this work, there has been an increase in social interest in the inhumane realities of French Guiana. One interesting point to add is the debate over the truthfulness of this work. Henri Charrière claimed that all of these stories are true experiences he personally went through. However, some researchers in later generations believe that some parts of this story are not based on Charrière's own experiences, but rather collected from the experiences of other prisoners, or that there are parts that have been dramatically adapted. Nonetheless, separate from this debate over authenticity, the depiction of the grim reality of the penal colony and the greatness of the human spirit in Papillon resonates deeply on its own. Regardless of the truth of the matter, the insights into the human spirit contained in this work remain valid. Closing. We have looked at Henri Charrière's Papillon together. A man with a butterfly tattoo on his chest. He was wrongfully imprisoned in a hellish penal colony, but he never gave up on the dream of freedom for 13 years. And finally, through that last gamble of throwing himself into the shark-infested sea, relying on a single coconut sack, he achieved freedom. The question that the story of Papillon leaves us with is this: what does freedom mean to you? And how desperately can you yearn for that freedom? Butterflies do not stay in one place. They endlessly soar into the sky in search of freedom. Papillon, he was a butterfly in the truest sense. No prison, no despair could stop his rise. I hope today's video resonated with you in some small way. Each of our lives may have its own type of land. But just as Papillon did, I hope you remember that the will for freedom within us is stronger than any wall. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We will return with another great work next time. Thank you sincerely for watching until now.